Thank you, Caroline. It's brilliant to hear. And I actually want to start with you by just following up on something you said about the fact that even within this diversity and inclusion community, disability has not always been included, even until very recently. Why is that?
I don't really know, to be honest. The disability movement has been very active. I mean, the whole phrase, nothing about us without us, I'm sure you've all heard. What I think, though, is that in the run-up to the SDGs, there was a recognition that the disability movement needed to come together. Now, what I used to find, particularly when I was going to see ministers in Africa, is they would get irritated with me. They would say, but Caroline, the deaf community were here yesterday, and then the people wanting ramps in school were here last Tuesday, and now you're here talking about the blind people. And I realized that you did actually have a lot of disability groups that were not coming together, were not talking as one voice, and sometimes were actually competing with each other for airtime, for money, for whatever. And what we really needed to do was galvanize the myriad of disabled people's organizations across the world and say, put that aside. You need to come together and you need to talk as one voice so that that voice is heard. And I think with the SDGs, we saw that. It was very emotional to see so very many people from all different countries, different types of disability, saying enough, we've been marginalized for too long. So, I think that may be partly why we're now on a much better path, but still loads to do.
And on that note, Tonya, picking up on something you said about the fact that as the police force, you were inspected.
Yes.
Do you think that being held accountable, being forced to show your work and your progress, is that useful? Or do we want to get to a stage where this is being, where the incentive is coming from within organisations and doesn't require any external motive? Because I'm thinking that you're an example of an organisation that has that. Most businesses aren't being inspected or monitored to the same extent.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good valid point. And I think what we'd like to see is that it is something that happens naturally without, it's not an inspection that forces us to go down that route. I think that's absolutely where we want to be, that this is just part of the fabric of the policing organisation and culture. But I think we do recognise that policing still has a long journey to go on. And we do know that when you have inspections, it does focus people's attention on the areas that need it. And then suddenly the penny drops, they think, I get it now. And it does make a difference. So I think we are going to need that inspection process to start and to keep the momentum going. But in time, I very much am, optimistic that it will just become part of the fabric and part of policing culture, because I think fundamentally that's quite a lot of what needs to change for us is our culture of policing.
Stephen, you take the opposite approach where you focus on nudging. It's the opposite of kind of imposing standards from the outside. Can nudges obviate the need for external pressure if they're done well, if they're done right?
Yeah, no, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think, it's such a complicated challenge that you need every tool you can. To build on this point about the inspection idea, we know that works. It's perhaps more for stick. But, it's the Bob Diamond quote, right, that culture is what happens when people think no one's watching you. So you can have all this great stuff going on, but it's how people behave as line managers when they're not being watched that really sets culture. So how do you get into that? And so any kind of pay transparency or media coverage, whatever, is great. So I'm quite positive about the transparency and how that's going. But on the nudges point, I think you need that as well. Because if I look at the kind of perennial problem of how do you tackle the middle management, right? You can train middle management, every year to the forever. You'll never crack it unless you basically also look at the systems that underpin the decisions that they make. And so, for example, if people can just hire without consistent questions, or one-on-one, or with non-mixed panels, then you'll never crack it. But if you have nudges such as we hire teams, not individuals, then you're going to choose diversity. And if you have nudges, whether it's something as ridiculous as men's urinals to have cleaner bathrooms, or whether it's something as important as, for example, the way you nudge performance management, then that matters too. And the organisations we work with do both. So you have some kind of transparency and you have the internal nudges, and then you measure to see the results.
Yes, with your urinals example, I think you've left us with an image that none of us will be able to unsee quickly. I could continue here, and I will if no one has any pressing questions, but please do come in if there's anything you'd like to ask. Oh, okay, well, we do have pressing questions, yes, up here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Mary from Business in the Community. It's been a really interesting day. I've got a question for Tonya, but interested in other views. Do you think the recently expressed irritation from the police, and I'm thinking particularly of Sarah Thornton backed up by Cressida Dick about hate crime, does that have a resonance for internal change and actually make people feel that it really doesn't matter?
Thank you.
That's a really good question, and I think there's two elements for that for me. I think hate crime, in its form as it's recognised now around criminal offences that police deal with, I think is well embedded, and police officers recognise that and are really driven and passionate to make a difference.
Do you want to just explain?
I think,
anyone hasn't been following.
Anyone that hasn't followed. So I think that the recent debate that arose was around introducing misogyny as a hate crime, and whether police would take that on and deal with it as a criminal offence. And the pushback from Sarah Thornton, who is the lead of the National Police Chiefs Council, head of National Police Chiefs Council, and Cressida Dick, the commissioner here in the Met, was, actually we have to draw a line somewhere, because, we are under incredible demands at the moment with, shrinking resources and the changing types of crime that are causing huge demands on our service. And actually, where do you draw the line? I think there's a recognition that we would all say it's absolutely not acceptable. We recognise misogyny is not acceptable. But in terms of if we then take that to the next level and have it as a hate crime, the service would struggle to cope, because we struggle to cope with. My personal view is we actually need to get a lot of the hate crime that we have at the moment. We need to get that right. We need to make reporting hate crime easier. And we talk about people with disability. We know that we don't make that easy enough for people. We need to get our reporting processes and our investigations around hate crime better as it stands. My personal view is if we then, I do agree with Sarah and Cressida that if we took misogyny into the fold as well, I don't think we're ready for that yet.
And what about just the kind of the other part of the question? And I'm thinking of the term that Stephen used about psychological safety. Mm-hmm. What's the message to women in the police if leadership are saying, we've got to draw a line and not treat this as a crime? How does that impact the culture for gender equality within the police? And do women in the police then feel that it doesn't give them confidence about misogyny and gender bias being taken seriously?
For me, this is about how leaders get those messages across. So I think it's really important to say that we recognise misogyny is not acceptable, and we don't accept it, but we don't have the resources to deal with it in the true sense. I think that the difficult bit around misogyny is the perpetrators or the offenders of it are never known to the victim. It's that woman walking down the street that gets wolf whistled and heckled. It's absolutely not acceptable, but your opportunities for investigation are limited from the outset, and we're still not saying it's right. So to try and answer the question, I think what we're saying, and I see it as a senior woman in policing myself, that I would want to see that my staff recognise that it's not acceptable and they're comfortable with that. But it's the other demands that we're dealing with as well. But giving them confidence that it's not right, but that they're supported.
Thank you very much for the question.
Yeah, it was a good question.
Yeah. Yes, and then here, lady here. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
I actually wanted to follow on from that. Sorry, oopsie, my bad. I'm Alicia Martin. I just graduated in June, and I'm here as youngest guest.
Congratulations.
But I wanted to follow on what you were saying about reporting hate crime, because I just thought, well, if you can't treat it criminally, can't we swap it to a civil issue? And then perhaps put policies and things in place that will make it easier to deal with. Because obviously, as you say, you haven't got the resources. So if you haven't got the resources to treat it as a crime, just obviously, because it is an issue, and saying draw the line there, that's the wrong message.
Are you thinking of something like ASBOs, which kind of were a civil,
civil
way of dealing with it?
Move it from crime to civil, and therefore it's easier to address, or not, or it can be addressed. Not so much easier, but it can be addressed. What do you think?
I don't know if the police can.
No, it's a difficult one for me to answer, because I'm dealing with criminal elements. Policing don't get involved in the civil elements, but I think it's a good point you raise. I still go back to, I think one of the challenges around it would be, even if it was to be something that was dealt with through civil orders, is actually identifying the perpetrators, because it all happens really quickly. And whereas in other more, what's the word I'm looking for, perhaps traditional hate crimes, apologies for the terminology there, quite often the victim of a hate crime will know who the perpetrator is. They will know it's a neighbour or it's somebody that they know, that so we can deal with that criminally. But with misogyny, that is a different area completely.
I'm curious, Caroline, whether you think it's useful generally, is the kind of the approach of cracking down on the behaviour of people who are hostile or aggressive or show hate towards people with disabilities, for example. Is that useful to you? Does that feel like it's in sync with your work?
I think we need to look at it in two different ways. So one of the things, yes, I mean, we see some appalling things. So I think probably the worst example for me, one is in Tanzania, where people who have albinism are killed and slaughtered and sometimes eaten, and they're seen as, magical powers. And that's, sometimes people are saying, oh, but that's their cultural belief. Well, I'm not interested in that. That's an outrageous thing. And we are having to, that's where those people should go to jail. That's a terrible thing. Then we also have areas, though, where it's about ignorance, and it's about trying to educate. So I've seen some tragic cases, mothers who've given birth to seriously disabled kids who believe that this is a punishment on them, or they did something. I mean, even in this country, it's not that long ago that a famous footballer actually said that, disability was a punishment from God. And we need to educate a lot of that community into what it means to be a disabled person, and also demonstrate what's possible for disabled people. So we have positive messages too, and we have a lot of great role models. So yes, I think in serious cases, we absolutely have to crack down, can't possibly do anything else. But just cracking down, just having that negative approach isn't enough. We really have to educate people, and in this country too, about positive attitudes and try and get rid of some of the prejudices that we see. And, it's the other reason why we're great supporters of inclusive education rather than special education, because then that means that kids mix with people with disabilities right from a very young age. It becomes seen as just, commonplace, people are just different and that's acceptable, rather than a special school, which can sometimes lead to ghettos, and people somehow seen as, if you're disabled, you get put in a special place, and then that means that you breed that suspicion and fear between different people.
Jo, yeah, I said Jo from Green Park. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jo Heath, partner at Green Park on the Diversity Inclusion consultancy practice. I actually resonated a lot there with what you said, Caroline. I'm a recovering stroke patient, 18 months in a wheelchair, and now have mental impairment in terms of my memory retention. So senior female, had that journey just a couple of years ago, real shock, and obviously tried to work through that process and started to realise how many barriers that I wasn't aware of, even though I've been operating in this space for many years. So the work that we do now, although isn't just around disability, touches upon it, and the audit work we do identifies low disclosure, different outcomes if you happen to disclose you have disability in terms of performance management, progression, different outcomes in terms of engagement. So my question to you is, if we know all this happens and we're doing more to attract more disabled people into work and into senior positions, how do we fix some of these issues, these different disproportionate outcomes we're seeing for disabled people?
I wish I had an easy answer. I really do.
Or have you seen an organisation that's done some more progressive work? Because I'm yet to see many.
I couldn't point to, if I'm honest, I couldn't point to an organisation that I think, well, they've done X and that's been the answer. I think, I've seen organisations, you have to do lots of different things. There isn't one magic bullet. And there are some areas where, I don't know quite what to do. I mean, I struggle more, particularly in our offices, I talked to you about in Africa and Asia, where one of the things that the challenges are is that people who are disabled don't get educated. I mean, 90% of them often won't go to school. And so then how do you find enough people with disabilities that you can put into the jobs that you want? Because that's one of the problems you're trying to overcome. And then also a lot of those people will then go and work for disabled people's organisations, the people we work with, where we're trying to build those organisations and make them stronger. How will that help them if I poach their staff to come and work for Sightsavers? So I'm really struggling and trying very, very hard. We're doing better in Asia now, but we're really still struggling in Africa. And I'll come back to, in the UK, I'm hoping that this intensive training work we're doing, which is not just telling people, I know you're a bit concerned about whether training will really work, but it's actually having opportunities for people to ask all those questions, to kind of slay some of those misunderstandings. I mean, even in Sightsavers, I've overheard over the years, and I've been there a long time, and hopefully it's better now, one person, when we were having a fire drill, saying, I think it's outrageous that we've got a blind person on the first floor because they're a fire hazard.
God.
I mean, crazy things like that you hear. And also, I'm going on to it. So there's an awful lot of ignorance, and I don't think it's malicious. I don't think people come to work for Sightsavers charity if they're prejudiced against youth disabilities. But a massive amount of ignorance.
I think it's a bit to do with Stephen's point as well around the systemic barriers, because if I look at progression rates for the organisations we work with and performance management ratings being applied, they're typically lower. And actually, that's not necessarily anything to do with the capability of the individual, it's to do with the systemic barriers. So a lot of our clients are saying, well, these disabled people are underperforming. Well, they're not actually. You're just not making any adjustments, particularly while they're rehabilitating, or to understand the level playing field. So
I just want to bring in Stephen, because Joe's question initially was, are there good practices? Have you got any examples of policies, practices, things that organisations have done that have helped improve outcomes for people with disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's few and far between and still a hell of a lot of work to do. So one biased one was, I'm biased because I head of diversity inclusion at the Olympics and Paralympics for 2012. And one of the things we did there was just decide to absolutely go for it on disability. And so one was we just tried to de-bias recruitment promotion. And we actually ended up with like thousands of disabled people amongst the paid and volunteer workforce. And speaking, I suppose, as somebody who doesn't have a disability, I mean, if I compare, for example, my sister who's disabled, myself is not, if you look at kind of both our perspectives on it, it changed me as much as it would change her. In the sense that, I spoke to loads of people who were identified as non-disabled at LOCOG, who were working alongside disabled people for the first time ever in their professional lives. And we know that one of the best ways to change attitudes is just contact. So yes, you can train, yes, you can do theory, but actual contact is one of the best ways. And you said yourself that actually, when you had your stroke and then you saw barriers you hadn't seen before, right? And it's that empathy building. So I think one of the ways is organisations that generally try to employ disabled people also change not simply lives and trajectories for disabled people, but crucially for those, the dominant group who aren't disabled, who have different perspectives on it. So that's one thing. In terms of training, like another simple thing is just really simple stuff, like training people to talk to the person, not the carer, or actually like just basic stuff which actually facilitates contact and facilitates conversation, which otherwise might not happen. And this is stuff that, good organisations, the big 4 KPMG, PwC, Unilever are doing quite well on, and so forth. So there's simple things like that, but I think for me one of the biggest things is just hiring and actually the opportunities for contact between groups otherwise wouldn't exist.
Brilliant. I'm so sorry we're all out of time. In fact, we're running late. It's just been subtly communicated to me that we need to wrap up. Thank you so much to this panel. It's been a fascinating session. Round of applause for them. Thank you.